What up, sluts? It's everybody's favorite pimp here. Really? Oh, for sure, dog. Everybody knows that. Obviously. No one really knows for sure Elevate Elu, Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is the Missouri we live by. No fucking bracha because today is a fucking tonight is Shavuot. Really? Oh, for sure, everybody. Duh. All right, here we go. 3761 creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 3631 137 son of Adam was born. 3526 235 Enosh son of Seth was born. 3436 325 Kenan son of Enosh was born. 3366 395 Mahalalel son of Kenan was born. 3301 460 Yared son of Mahalalel was born. 3139 622 Hanak son of Yared was born.
Explore the arcane.
Yo, dog, we've been doing this bitch for 146 days. Is that true? No one knows. Really? I don't fucking know. I don't fucking care. Really? Meet you on the way. That bitch can get it. She was hot. Really? For sure. Everybody knows that though. There's the thing. 146 days of this bitch. Anything else?
Philosophy and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have all been numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021, and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics that are supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or Brahation below. I highly appreciate your consideration. Now, of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Alright, folks, welcome back. Some more Shabbatite excitement. We're really going to get into some of the technical stuff around Shabbatite Tzvi, and we're going to talk about how what was at some level a very fringe movement became a dominant movement in the Jewish world in the middle of the 16th, 17th century, and eventually how you would think that the death of Shabbatai and the death of his prophet would have spelled the end for the entire movement, but as you probably know, dying is not really an impediment for Messiahs. Messiahs die all the time. Their believers keep on believing in them as if nothing happened, whether it's Jesus of Nazareth or Menachem Mendel Schneerson, continue to believe in their Messiah's death. It's just a speed bump on the way to eternity. And so we'll turn to that and how the Shabbatian movement continued after Shabbatai's death and how it thrived, probably at least into the 1880s, maybe even later than that, especially in Turkey. Although we don't know what its status is these days in Turkey. So what is the recap? There was a guy in the 17th century that believed he was the Messiah, and so did half the world's Jews. That's the recap. There was a guy, Shabbatai Tzvi, who was declared a Messiah by a relatively minor Kabbalist and healer in Gaza, Nathan of Gaza, Nosan Gazati, and he was declared Messiah in 1665. Although he had messianic pretensions as early as 1648. And between 1665 and 1666, half of the world's Jews seemed to have accepted his messianic claims. And this is evidenced by the most classic example of the evidence for this is the prayer books that get printed. The prayer books that have pictures of Shabbatai Tzvi in them. The prayer books that have prayers for Shabbatai Tzvi. The letters that come over and over again from major rabbinical figures all over the Jewish world that affirm belief in Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah. And we talked a bit last time about the life of Shabbatai Tzvi, the sort of the ups and downs of his life, of Nathan of Gaza, and things like this. So we talked a bit about the life and time of Shabbatai Tzvi, but what we did is exactly how he set the Messiah. How does that work exactly? Right? So what exactly does it mean to say that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah? And how this dovetails in a really important way as a part of our discussions here on Kabbalah is that one can only understand the messianic claims of Shabbatai Tzvi or of Nathan of Gaza by understanding how that was justified. And that was justified by Kabbalah, basically. It was justified, underwritten by Kabbalah. The Kabbalah enabled Nathan of Gaza and at some level Shabbatai Tzvi to develop this messianic story that allowed claim that he was the Messiah, and for Nathan of Gaza to greatly popularize his messianic claims. Now, there's a couple to know that are important about Shabbatai Tzvi and Nathan of Gaza, his prophet, and how they're quite different in terms of their relationship to Kabbalah. The first thing that's really important to know is that they don't really have the same education. Shabbatai Tzvi is kind of a yeshiva dropout. He's very talented, he's very smart, and of course he's very charismatic, more charismatic than anything else, I suspect. But Shabbatai Tzvi doesn't have a very strong grasp on Kabbalah. He certainly knows the Zohar very well. We know that. He's been studying the Zohar since he was a teenager. So he has a very strong grasp on the Zohar. But the developments in the Koraveran system of Kabbalah, the developments in the world of Sfat, the world of Lurianic Kabbalah, there's actually very little evidence that Shabbatai Tzvi had a grasp of those developments. He doesn't seem to understand or appreciate or have had education in the very complex world of Lurianic Kabbalah. So we have just a difference in education level when it comes to Kabbalah and Shabbatai Tzvi and Nathan of Gaza. Now, Nathan of Gaza, which is really important to know about Nathan of Gaza, is he is hyper aware of the developments in Lurianic Kabbalah. And I mean hyper aware. He is so well educated that if you read some of his Kabbalistic works, which are among the most technical Kabbalistic texts written at the time, he knows very subtle differences between different schools of Kabbalah. So he even knows differences between how very technical ideas in Lurianic Kabbalah are being debated among very high-level people in that world. For instance, people like Israel Sarug and Chaim Vital. So Nathan of Gaza is someone who knows these conversations. He is a technical maestro when it comes to the developments. He's at the cutting edge at some level of some of these developments. And it's going to be really important because how Nathan of Gaza is going to justify Shabbatai Tzvi's messianic claims are going to be by appealing to and what's the right word? Augmenting, changing, corrupting, whatever word you want to use. He's going to be relying heavily on Lurianic Kabbalah, but he's going to do his own thing too. He's going to do his own thing. We'll see this in just a moment. Shabbatai, for him, his messianic claims, which we can see in his letters, are not justified by appealing to complex ideas of Lurianic Kabbalah because he doesn't know much about it. He's claiming that he's the Messiah because God chose him and because he has a relationship with God. That is to say, Hashem and Shabbatai are friends. So when Shabbatai calls God by God's name, Yod-Heh-Vah-Peh, Shabbatai doesn't imagine he's doing something transgressive. He knows he's not supposed to do it. But he has this intense personal relationship with God that he can call Peh. Shabbatai doesn't imagine he's doing something transgressive. That is to say, Hashem and Shabbatai are friends. So when Shabbatai calls God by God's name, Yod-Heh-Vah-Peh, Shabbatai doesn't imagine he's doing something transgressive. He knows he's not supposed to do it. But he has this intense personal relationship with God that he can call God by God's name. So for him, for Shabbatai, it has nothing to do with some very complex Kabbalistic mythological stuff. It has to do with the fact that God and Shabbatai are close, that he and God have a relationship. And that relationship is one of anointing, is one of, I've been invited into the world of Godhead, and I have a relationship with Hashem. Now, that to me, it might sound really Christian. That might sound really, really Christian to you. And in fact, one of the things that Shabbatai talks about all the time is Christianity. He talks about Jesus. He says, one of the things I'm going to do in this whole messianic business is redeem Jesus. He's very influenced at some level by Christianity. And part of what I think makes the Jewish world very uncomfortable with Shabbatai is not his transgressive behavior. His transgressive behavior gets really overplayed for reasons we'll talk about later. But it's not his transgressive behavior, it's his syncretism. That he's okay with the idea of incorporating Christian elements, with incorporating secular elements, with incorporating Islamic elements. That's what worries the Jewish establishment. It's his syncretism that makes them really angry. Of course, he does these transgressive things, and that pisses them off too. But really, it's the syncretism that really gets him. And I think that's something that's come forward new in the scholarship. And we were just talking about this before the recording started, is that part of what's going on now in the scholarship is we're now beginning to realize that Shabbatai Tzvi was much more at the helm of understanding what was going on than the previous generation of scholarship, mostly Gershom Scholem, thought. Scholem basically thought that at some level, Shabbatai Tzvi was a yeshiva dropout who had no real understanding of Judaism, much less really Kabbalah, and that he was a mentally ill person that rode on the coattails of the great prophet Nathan of Gaza. That was the theory that really, if you read Scholem's work, that's the theory that goes. More recent scholarship by Yehuda Leib and other kinds of folks, with Pavel Majenko, that we really now know that's not true. Because we have letters from Shabbatai Tzvi explaining why he thinks he's the Messiah. And he gives very different reasons for why he thinks he's the Messiah, as opposed to why Nathan of Gaza thinks that he is. So we're getting a much more complicated vision of who Shabbatai Tzvi was, his theology, his ideas of his own messiahhood. We're getting those ideas, and this shows you that the scholarship is continuing to evolve. So let's get into Nathan of Gaza's theory, right? Let's get into Nathan of Gaza's theory, because that's going to really tie us back to the Kabbalah in a big way. So what does Nathan of Gaza think? Why does Nathan of Gaza think that Shabbatai is the Messiah? So it has everything to do with Kabbalah. It has everything to do with Lurianic Kabbalah. So just to rewind a little bit, right, we'll remember from the Lurianic theory that God was originally an infinite fullness, and that fullness filled the entire everything. And that in order to create creation, God had to contract God's self, and that act of contraction is called tzimtzum. Well, when God contracted God's self into the tzimtzum, that left behind a void, what we call the tehiru in Hebrew. And the tehiru, right, when it was evacuated, according to the Lurianic Kabbalah, it left behind traces of the divine. There are sort of fragments of God left behind. I always imagine, you ever poured out oil from a cooking pan? There's always oil left, no matter how much you tip it over. You can't quite get all the oil out. The traces of the oil, the traces of the divine light, the reshimu, coated or fragmented all over inside of the tehiru, of the void. Well, some of those aspects of those traces within the divine void contain elements of divine judgment. Remember, divine judgment in the Kabbalah is always thought of when divine judgment isn't checked by other forces, that is evil. It's unbridled judgment, deen. Well, those elements of deen, of unbridled judgment that remain inside of the Tehiru, in terms of the void, those elements of unbridled vengeance and judgment, they sank to the bottom of that void. And as they sank to the bottom of that void, those elements became the sort of the abyss, this sort of demonic world at the bottom of that void, of the gap that when God that area, by the way, is called the Golem in Lorena Kabbalah. It's called the Golem. It's the unformed world. This is sort of chaos. It's a tohu vabohu. It's this chaotic nightmare where all the evil has sunk to the bottom of the void. All right, so when God shoots God's light into that void, at the very tip of that sphere, at the very tip of Yesod, at the tip of God's phallus, I suppose, at the tip of God's Yesod, the tip of that sphere that light plunges all the way in to the void, to the Tehiru, and the tip of that, and this is where Nathan of Gaza comes in. It's not Lurianic Kabbalah, it's Nathan of Gaza. The tip of that void shoots all the way into the very bottom of the void, of the abyss where the demons are, and the tip of that is the soul of the Messiah. The soul of the Messiah is the tip of the spear, the tip of the light going all the way in. And as soon as it reaches the bottom, it comes back up, and all of God's remaining judgment in Ein Sof floods into the void, the demonic abyss, the golem, and the soul of the Messiah is the only thing good left at the bottom of that chaotic, nightmarish abyss of evil. The soul of the Messiah is born, is deposited, according to Nathan of Gaza, at the very bottom of the abyss. And that abyss is filled with every form of evil imaginable. Every form of evil imaginable. The soul of the Messiah is born there, is put there. And there, the soul of the Messiah becomes infused with all. And it's only through this unimaginable process where the soul of the Messiah has to redeem itself, has to climb out of this horrifying, that in the process of redeeming itself, eventually it pulls itself all the way up, right through these horrific world called the Tanaim, the dragons. The text of this is called Drush Tanaim, the treatise on dragons. As the Messiah's soul fights vigorously, strives vigorously to purify itself, all this evil, eventually the soul of the Messiah reaches sort of the event horizon, right? If you want to think about this in terms of a black hole, it's like a black hole, but eventually the soul of the Messiah can get to the very top of the event horizon, right? And just barely pop through. Now, when it barely pops through this horrific world of demonic power, it's still corrupted deeply with demonic power. It's still infused with evil. And so it's still some battle of good and evil. It's still deeply polarized between really the soul of the Messiah and really, really bad, right? The evil world of the Klipot, the shards. And actually crosses back through the event horizon of evil, which you can't do with a black hole, but it crosses through. And it still climbs out of the world of Klipot. It has to find the body. And when it finds the body, the soul root that finds the body, whose body did it find? It found the body, according to Nathan of Gaza, of poor Shabbatai Tzvi. And that explains Shabbatai Tzvi. That explains these, according to Nathan of Gaza, these illuminations and these darkness periods, this sort of manic behavior, manic depression. It explains why he can be completely righteous and in love with God, and yet do these transgressive things, where he says that the 17th of Tammuz or whatever is a feast day rather than a fast. And it's that. It's exactly Shabbatai's manic, depressive side of Shabbatai is the struggle messianic soul against the world of evil, and for Nathan, this entire process is the final act of history. Once Shabbatai is purified of all of this evil, then everything will be redeemed. He is embodying the Lord of Gaza. He embodies this final titanic struggle of good and evil. Now, what did the apostasy mean? Right? Because again, Nathan of Gaza is formulating this idea in 1665. Nathan of Shabbatai apostatizes in 1666. Well, we have two completely different theories about what's going on here. We have Nathan's theory. Nathan's theory is that Shabbatai is plunging himself into the world of evil, that is to say, Gentile religion. Nathan of Gaza has nothing good to say about the Gentiles. He's plunging himself into the world of evil in order to basically undermine it. That is to say, he's destroying it from the inside. Nathan of Gaza's theology is always the idea that Shabbatai is plunging himself into this to destroy it. He's like a double agent. He's sneaking into the world of he's not really apostatizing. He's pretending to apostatize, to plunge himself into this world, to undermine it, to destroy the Klippot. What we now know from Shabbatai's letters, right? We have another view, which again is actually Shabbatai's view. Shabbatai also thought he was a Messiah. Shabbatai's view was that he was plunging himself into this in order to redeem Islam. He thought of himself as a redeemer. He wasn't going into Islam to destroy it. He thought there was positive things in Islam. He thought there was positive things in Christianity. And the idea was that ultimately, by plunging himself into this, by plunging himself into Islam, he could redeem the world of the Muslims, and that would be part of the grand redemption. Notice they're very different theories. Notice that what Nathan thought was happening is one thing, and what Shabbatai is happening is something completely different. So notice here, even the Shabbatian movement isn't coherent in terms of what they thought was happening in terms of Shabbatai's messianic mission. And that's not surprising, because if you look at early Christianity, it's not clear that early Christianity really understood what Jesus' messianic mission was. And there was a huge debate about that. Paul thought one thing, James thought another, Peter thought something else. It's not clear that anyone really had a clear idea that his messianic mission was X, Y, or Z. And so we have these big debates in the church, ditto with the Shabbatian movement. Now, what's key about this, right, is that we have three important interlocking things that make this important. The first is all of them agree that whatever Messiah means, it does not mean the traditional idea of Messiah, which we talked about last time, which is the idea of a political Messiah. This is a spiritualization, the same thing that the Jesus movement did with Jesus, the Shabbatian movement does with Shabbatai, ditto with, I'm sure it isn't a plus. Further, we have this quasi-Lurianic justification for Shabbatai's claims. Now, what's quasi-Messianic justifications for Shabbatai's Messianic claims is that they're going to be the ones that largely stick. Now, it's a case that Saints did have some letters of Shabbatai. Actually, what's going to stick is going to be the Lurianic quasi-Lurianic, because a lot of this is not Luria, this is Luria. Riffing on Luria is a kind way of putting it. But yeah, it's riffing on Luria. And third, this is all part of a larger apocalyptic agenda, as we mentioned last time. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. The 17th century, the mid-17th century, was an age of hyper-apocalypticism. I mean, folks who remember the 1990s, remember the 1990s and how apocalyptic that was. You have the Branch Davidians, you have Y2K, you have all this stuff, you have Heaven's Gate. It was a very apocalyptic time. We'll take that and turn it up to 50. And that gives you some sense of how crazily apocalyptic the 17th century was. So this is part of a much bigger apocalyptic world, and Shabbatai's messianic claims are all about the end of the world. And to give it a sense of that, I want to read a letter of Nathan of Gaza here, just a chunk of a letter from Nathan of Gaza, relatively briefly, just so you know kind of what the mood felt like. So this is a letter of Nathan of Gaza to Raphael Joseph, who was a Chalebi of Cairo, a big wig dude in Cairo. In fact, he was the guy that gave Shabbatai shot. So I'm reading the translated lines of Nathan of Gaza. Quote, nowadays, we again face opposing forces. They are wholly ineffective, however, and injure no one but themselves. For the final end is now upon us. Again, the apocalyptic level, the final end is now upon us. This being so, Nathan writes, you must not wonder why, by what special merit our generation has come to deserve it. In addition, there are these dreadful agonies, inconceivable and limitless, that Rabbi Shabbatai Tzvi has suffered on behalf of the Jewish nation. Consequently, he has full power to do with this neighbor he pleases, to justify or shalom condemn them. He may justify the most existent, even someone like Jesus, or condemn anyone who doubts him, even if he be the most pious person alive, to unspeakable torments. You must treat the following principle as absolutely certain. The Jewish people cannot attain to life other than by believing these things without any sign or miracle. All this is God's purpose enacted in this generation, worthy to see the beginnings of the redemption. The beginnings of the redemption. You must have no concern whatever for them not believe, even if they be your close personal friends. And then after that, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai describes the outline of what Nathan of Gaza thinks is going to be roughly a 100-year period in which everything all this is going to go down, and you get a sort of timeline about how this thing is going to go down, how Shabbatai is going to go, and all kinds of stuff. It's very, very bizarre. But at any rate, that gives you some sense of the fervor that Nathan of Gaza puts onto all this. Now, as we mentioned, Shabbatai died, and so did Nathan of Gaza. In fact, after Shabbatai died, Nathan of Gaza kind of redoubles his efforts, and he argues basically that Shabbatai's death is a kind of illusion, that Shabbatai is not dead, he's just hidden, right? That was an idea to be found also in Shia and Ismaili Islam, that he was occulted, and at some point very, very soon, he would reveal himself again in his full glory. Again, are they leaning on Christianity at some level here? It sounds like it. It sounds like very Christian, that he's just hidden. So this is a kind of, it's kind of Shia, kind of Ismaili, kind of Christian move, that Shabbatai is not dead, he's just hidden. Now, what ends up happening in all of this, right, is that there is something of a combination that's already happened in Shabbatai's life, or the end of his life, where some Sufi ideas have begun to enter the inner circle of Shabbatai's theology, and those Sufi Islamic ideas begin to form a kind of synthetic theology. And that synthetic theology allows for the idea that, again, Shabbatai might be occluded, he's actually not dead. And what we have is over and over again these predictions that Shabbatai will this year and this year and this year, and of course he never does. And eventually Nathan of Gaza, well, he dies. Nathan of Gaza dies, and as soon as Nathan of Gaza dies, the movement immediately begins to fracture. Because of course, when you have Nathan of Gaza, who's probably one of the more talented Kabbalists of his day, unable to basically continue to steer the movement via his theoretical Kabbalah, the movement begins to fall apart. And the first person to really pick up the reins of this movement will be Abraham Cardozo, himself a very strong believer in Shabbatai. He would travel all around the Eastern Mediterranean basin, but also through Europe. He would be proclaiming the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai Tzvi, and he was murdered in 1706. So he was a huge promulgator of Shabbatian doctrine until he was killed. Now, the other side of this is that once Shabbatai died, the women in the movement really take up the reins. And again, is this surprising? No. Think about Jesus. The moment that Jesus died, who were the only people there at the grave? It was the women, right? We have the Marys, right? We have the women there. The men all scattered, in some big way hold the reins of the movement very early on. And in fact, there's some really great studies about Shabbatian women prophets and how the Shabbatian women prophets really both made the movement work, but also propelled the movement after Shabbatai had died. Now, you'll remember that Shabbatai remarried after his first wife died, and his second wife, Aisha, or Yocheved, she went by both names. Actually, Aisha, or Yocheved, declared that her younger brother, Yaakov Corrido, was in fact the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi. So, what we have, again, is the use of Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of soul roots, and Gilgul HaNeshemot, the idea of reincarnation, being marshaled to show that there is a continuity of Shabbatai Tzvi's soul. He's not dead. He's just reincarnated reincarnated. He's reincarnated, of course, into the younger brother here of Aisha, Yocheved. And what ends up happening in this whole process is that there is some pressure being put on these quasi-Shabbatian Jews, Muslims, that are there living in places like Salonika and in places around the Shabbatian movement. Remember that part of what happened with Shabbat Tzvi is he was condemned for not being Muslim enough and was exiled all the way in what is now Montenegro. And so some of the people around him that stayed around him, about 300 families or so, these were Jewish believers in Shabbatai who had never converted to Islam. And eventually, with Aisha's pressure, probably she's getting pressure on her, they all convert. Right? We get a mass conversion of about 300 families who do convert to Islam in 1683, some years after Shabbatai died. That core of about 300 families, right, which is the size of basically the synagogue I grew up in, that core was going to form the core of the post-Shabbatian movement. And over around a century, right, we have about, that number grows to about 600 families, and over time, what would end up happening is in that time period, in the generation after Shabbatai's death, the new faith of the Shabbatian movement would take effect. And basically, the new faith looks something like this. There is a Torah that is composed of 18 laws. There are 18 laws that make up the Torah of the Shabbatian movement. They do not have a relationship with Jews, and they have outward relationship with Muslims, but they don't marry with Muslims, and they don't bury their dead with Muslims. So they don't associate with the Jewish crowd, because obviously they're not Jews anymore, they're Muslims now. But what's important is they still follow an underground form of Judaism made up of 18 laws, and that they only marry within their own ranks, and they only bury within their own ranks. And what ends up happening is this group of converted Muslim, Jew, Shabbatian people, they don't actually observe Islam completely, and they dissimulate. They lie about the degree to which they're really Muslims, and this actually has precedent in some lodges in the Sufi movement. This is an idea called taqiyya, not taqiyya, and not taqiyya, not the Hebrew word taqiyya. This is the idea that you can hide your Sufi beliefs. If those Sufi beliefs can get you physically in danger, they can endanger you. So what they're living is basically a dual life. They're living quietly as kind of Jews, but publicly they're living as Muslims. And they're still not quite Muslims, and they're still certainly not Jews. They're something else. And this something else is going to eventually evolve into its own religion. Now, inside of the movement, as you might imagine, there are further fractures. The two major fractures, and there's going to be three major fractures within the Shabbatian movement that will occur. The first major fracture is that there's going to be another incarnation of, so-called incarnation of Shabbat Tzvi and Grecia Russo, who is known in Turkish as Ozan Baba. He will die in 1720, which, by the way, is telling you how close we're getting to this point. And he's declared to be one of the really important, he's going to be the movement of Shabbat Tzvi. This is going to break the movement into two different groups. The smaller movement, which is the Yaqubi movement. The Yaqubi movement is actually very close to Sunni Orthodox Islam in the Karakashi movement. And the Karakashi movement is going to be much more syncretistic with Judaism. It's going to maintain some relationships with Judaism, much more heavily Sufi influenced. What's important to know about the Karakashi movement is that they're going to have missionaries. And those missionaries are going to be sent to Eastern Europe. And where is this movement developing? It's developing primarily in Salonika. It's developing in places like Montenegro. They're going to move their way into Central Europe, and eventually they're going to reach the core of Central Europe in the Podolia region in Poland. And as you know, the Podolia region in Poland is going to be absolutely core in all this. We'll get to that in a minute. There's going to be a third and final split. This is the Kapansi movement. This is the group that rejects the whole reincarnation theory, reject the idea that Osman Baba is in fact the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, and that there has been no reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, only Shabbatai Tzvi the Messiah, And this version, right, the Apache movement, is the idea that Shabbatai Tzvi is the only form of the Messiah. That group, which is actually pretty close to the very popular Mevlevis of the order, which I imagine folks know the Mevlevis, right? Those are the whirling dervishes. These are the famous whirling dervishes in the Sufi movement. So they're very close to them in a lot of ways. It's that part of the Shabbatian movement that's going to go on to become the one that will survive in Turkey. That one will survive in Turkey. We'll talk about that in a minute. So by the early to the mid 18th century, these groups would become the core of what we call the Shabbatian movement in the Ottoman Empire. And collectively, they're referred to as Dunme. Right? Dunme. Now, this word actually means apostate, and many of them would not call themselves Dunme, but I would call them something like conversos or the Shabbatians, but the name Dunme is stuck. Now, you might be asking how many of these Dunme were there in the Ottoman Empire. Well, they had a bit of a problem in terms of growing themselves because they only married within their own families, which led to all kinds of problems. So they were probably, we guess, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Dunme in the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn of the 20th century, there were 10,000 of these Shabbatians living in the Ottoman Empire. They were practicing Jews of a very strange type. But they lived on the outside as Muslims, but on the inside they lived secretly as a kind of Jew. And they were kind of accepted. Everyone knew, I think, that they weren't Muslims, and everyone kind of knew that they weren't really Jews. They kind of did their own thing. They buried their own dead in their own graveyards. They only buried each other. They lived in the same part of Salonika and eventually Istanbul. They were their own thing. And everyone at some level knew this. Now, what's important about the Dunme is that there are two things that are really important that are known about them, is that they became very well educated and very, very wealthy. Often true for very tight communities, right? That is to say, they became skilled craftsmen, they became skilled tradesmen, and they kept their money indoors, and they become actually quite educated and actually quite wealthy. And they were some of the earliest Turks to turn toward the West in the process of sort of modernization. And as the Ottoman Empire began to come apart, the Dunme formed, in some level, the core of the Young Turks. And the Young Turks, as you probably know, are the folks that led the modernization of Turkey. They revitalized the Turkish language. And in many ways, they formed the core of the process in which Turkey would modernize. And in many ways, these Dunme, which we now know the Dunme, formed a pretty significant element of the Young Turk movement, which means they played a pivotal role in the development of Turkey as a modern nation. Now, the tide of it would all turn. In fact, I think I said this right I think this is on the slide. The first foreign ministry for the new government of Turkey would be a Karakashi Dunme. So the first foreign minister, that's a big deal. That's a high-ranking member of the Turkish government, was Dunme. So now the problem with this is, as the 20th century wore on, Turkey and, of course, Israel came into loggerheads about all kinds of things. And what ended up happening was that there was a huge anti-Semitic backlash in Turkey, and that anti-Semitic backlash caught Dunme. Dunme were thought of as secret Jews, and the idea that they were secret Jews was even more terrible because they were, conspiracy theories and stuff that fled through Turkey. And so many of the Dunme basically completely abandoned any Judaism, and many of them just completely ceased being Dunme and became completely secular. They became completely secular. But the question now these days, by the way, is, are there any Dunme in Turkey at all? And we don't know. We don't know. I think I mentioned this last time in my last lecture on the Shabbatians. I had a student in a class at Tomer Shabbat Tzvi. She came from a Dunme family, and she said that in Turkey, she would ask other people, and they would say, "Yeah, I come from a family of Karkeshi people, or I come from a family of Kampasi people, but no, I'm just a secular person. My father was secular. My grandfather may have visited, whatever, a tomb of someone, but no, there are no practicing Dunme left in Turkey." The problem with this, of course, is we don't know, because part of what the Dunme do is they don't tell anyone they practice. They practice this idea of takia, which means they don't make it public they are, in fact, Shabbatians. So are there Shabbatians left in Turkey? Maybe. Probably not. They're probably extinct. But are there Dolmet families left in Turkey? Probably. Yeah, there are definitely Dolmet families left in Turkey. But are there any practicing Shabbatians in Turkey? The data seems to indicate no. It seems to be an extinct religion. But I'm leaving the door open for the possibility that they're still over there, but I think that the odds of them actually surviving are pretty low. So that gives us some idea that the Dolmet at some level Shabbatianism continued to thrive and thrive all the way into at least the mid-20th century in Turkey. Now, as I mentioned, right, the Karakashi sect, the sect that holds that Osman Baba is the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, again, to get some idea of where we are, we're on 1720. That sect, the Karakashi were much more willing to mix Judaism and Islam. And remember, it was that sect that sent the first post-Shabbatai missionaries into Eastern Europe. Now, you might wonder, why in the world would anyone listen to this in Eastern Europe? Why would you hear these guys out? Shabbatai's dead. He's been dead for a generation. It was a huge disappointment. It was a disaster. This entire thing was a disaster. Why would any Jews listen to the idea that Shabbatai is the Messiah, despite the fact this entire disaster has happened? Well, the first thing is that news of Shabbatai's death actually happened really slow. It took a long time to get to Central Europe. And so unlike in the Ottoman Empire, where the news traveled very fast, by the time the news got to Central Europe, Poland, things were very slow. And frankly, people weren't terribly educated. Jews in Central Europe in the early 18th century, Jews in Central Europe in the late 17th century, the early 16th century, late 17th century, yeah, really educated. This is a very, very rural, very superstitious, very mystically inclined group of people. Remember that the Judaism of the Ashkenaz, the Ashkenaz have historically been very interested in supernatural, very taken with those ideas. Secondly, knowledge of Kabbalah at that time was very, very piecemeal in that area. Now, knowledge of Kabbalah in other areas was much higher, but at this point, early on in late in the 17th century, knowledge of Kabbalah was very, very piecemeal, very fractured. What's important to know about this is those people coming in, some of these Karakashi missionaries carrying the gospel of Shabbatai Tzvi, had a much higher degree of Kabbalistic education at some level than the local people did. So this is very impressive. Further, Orthodox Judaism in this region was much, much more oriented at the level of practice than belief. What really mattered for these people, and this is true for many factions of Judaism, is it matters much more what you do at some level than what you believe. And so belief was a bit more weird. You could have a much more broader range of belief and still practice Judaism. You could believe all kinds of things about werewolves, vampires, and stuff, and it was okay as long as you practiced Judaism in a nominal way. And further, these communities were very precarious. You're talking about a place where during Shabbat, right before Shabbatai, experienced a giant pogrom that killed 100,000 Jews. Problems with the local population, where there were constant pogroms. Also, just a level of instability and fear and claims like that, where there is a kind of precarious existence, are much more. They become much more tenable. It's much more easy to be poor, uneducated, or live a precarious Messiah, as opposed to other people. Again, that's true. You can see that playing itself out lots of times in history. When the Shabbatian movement landed in Central Europe, in general, it kind of took. And it's always going to kind of take in Central Europe. We'll talk more about that. Now, this is what's happening in the aftermath of Shabbatai Tzvi's apostasy in 1666. Most people deconverted. They rejected his messiahship. What typically happens in the Jewish world? Someone gets to be the Messiah, they don't follow the rules, and we reject it. Well, what ends up happening is that typically the rabbis that were almost always the anti-Shabbatai people were the Messiah, or were the rabbis of the local region, like the House of Israel, For instance, in Amsterdam, in Manasseh ben Israel, it was anti-Shabbatian the entire time. Once the fervor of the Messianic movement ended, Manasseh ben Israel was basically able to bring his flock in and kind of shepherd them in the aftermath of this disaster. So in many ways, Amsterdam was really typical because Amsterdam was hotly Messianic, very Messianic, maybe one of the largest Messianic centers in the world. And then after the 1666 apostasy, people were really disappointed. And Manasseh ben Israel, the rabbi of the community there, was able to basically shepherd them through the disaster. What ends up happening, however, in Central Europe is that some of the rabbis that were converted and some of the rabbis affected or influenced by these missionaries, some of these learned rabbis continued to hold their faith in Shabbatai in private while in public denying it and remaining Orthodox. So we have people that are secretly maintaining some kind of Shabbatian ideas, and yet at the same time, publicly, they are not holding on to them in public. We call these people crypto-Shabbatians. And what ends up happening is that as Kabbalistic ideas begin to make their way into Central Europe in the aftermath of Shabbatai, you can sort of imagine Shabbatai as the wave that reaches in, and that when Shabbatai brings the Messiah of Shabbatai brings the wave into Central Europe, what gets left behind after he leaves, after he sort of washes out, his Messianic plans wash out, what gets left behind is the Kabbalah. So he brings in the Kabbalah, and then he comes out because he's either apostated or whatever, and what's left behind is the Kabbalah. And so as he leaves behind, as the movement leaves behind these Kabbalistic traces, the rabbis who are left behind with the belief in Shabbatai to be as the Messiah continue to believe in Shabbatianism as a Messianic movement, all the while still holding on to many of these Kabbalistic ideas, and it's the Kabbalistic ideas that still continue to convince them that he is in fact the Messiah, that maybe he is occulted, maybe he is actually just diving himself into the deep recesses of the Klipot, and that he will eventually redeem them somehow, right? This is all part of the plan. And what ends up happening is that very early Kabbalah in Central Europe is always at some level tinged with the Shabbatian element. All of Kabbalah in Central Europe in the early 18th century, late 17th century is going to be tinged with Shabbatian elements. And what we have are a lot of crypto-Shabbatian works, right? Chemdat Yamin, Shemdat Musar. We have other kinds of movements, other kinds of texts that are incredibly influential. We'll talk about that influence in just a minute. And this ultimately erupts in the Emden Eibeschutz controversy. And the Emden Eibeschutz controversy is a situation where two very, very, very prominent rabbis, one of them, Eibeschutz, is declared to be a Shabbatian. He's declared to be a crypto-Shabbatian. He said, no, I'm not, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. And this debate, by the way, was not settled in their lifetime. Both Emden and Eibeschutz eventually died. And for a long time, people believed that Emden's critique of us, that he was not really a Shabbatian. Now we know that he probably was. He probably was. We actually have good reason to believe now that he was in fact a Shabbatian, crypto-Shabbatian. In fact, to this day, it's unclear who was and who wasn't. We still don't know who was a Shabbatian and who was in this time period. And this is not good. This would be a minor issue if it weren't for the emergence of the most important Jewish movement in basically the modern period. And that movement, of course, is Hasidism. And so in many ways, the disdain between the Shabbatians and the anti-Shabbatians, the crypto-Shabbatians and their condemners, is also going to track to the rise of Hasidism and the Mitnagdim, the people that condemn them, the opponents of the Mitnagdim that in the century that comes later. Now, I want to make some really controversial statements that will make people who are very amenable to Hasidism maybe a little upset, but the data is now showing, the evidence is now showing that early Hasidism and Shabbatianism, there is a relationship there. It's obscure and it's difficult, but there are so many overlapping elements of both early Hasidism and European Shabbatianism that it's, I think, undeniable that at some level, the movement, the Hasidic movement, at some level, is at least influenced by Shabbatianism. I don't want to say an outgrowth of Shabbatianism. I don't think that's true. But the idea that they're completely distinct, I think, is no longer holdable by the Hasidic movement. They would deny it, but I think it's there. So, why do I think that? Well, it's, for instance, things like the role of the tzaddik or the Rebbe, the idea that they are a sort of intermediary, a kind of quasi Messiah, as they act as sort of a intermediary between them and God. The Rebbe is often sometimes thought of engaging in transgression for the sake of heaven. This idea that they suffer on behalf of the community, for the community. The emergence of both of these movements, the Shabbatia movement and the Hasidic movement, both emerge in the exact same region of Poland, the Podolia region. The Baal Shem Tov is from there. We'll talk about Hasidism next time, but I'm just saying at this point, I do think that the Hasidic movement and the Shabbatia movement that there's some overlap. Both of them are very influenced by Kabbalah, Lorrainic Kabbalah. There's an antinomian streak in Hasidism. Obviously, you can find that in Shabbatism as well. There's this stuff of Avodah B'Gashmiut, the sort of physical stuff that the Hasidic people do that also seems to be also overlapping with some Shabbatinism as well. Although typically the Hasidic movement is largely halachically Jewish law-wise, very conservative, but there's still an antinomian streak, and there's even legal innovations in Hasidism that are not to be found in the Misnag movement. For instance, the wearing of tefillin during Chol Moed, that is deeply influenced by Kabbalah. It's not to be found in more Litvak style Judaism. That's an element that comes especially in Hasidism. As you probably know, the world of Hasidism is very court-like. It's very royal. The Rebbe is treated almost as a kind of regal figure, as a kind of king, and there is a quasi-messianic attitude toward the Rebbes in the Hasidic movement. We know that Shabbatian text played a huge role in early Hasidism, especially Chabad Yamim, and in many ways, the Misnag movement, the Litvak movement, the movement that was very critical of Hasidism, saw in many ways Hasidism as a extension of the Shabbati movement. And early on, when the Vilna Gaon really goes after the early Hasids, he really claims that under the hood of it all is Shabbatinism, that they actually are Shabbatists. Now, I think that in general, does the Vilna Gaon overplay his cards? Maybe he does overplay his cards. But is he completely off base? I don't think so. I think the Vilna Gaon is not crazy, and he's not a fool. I think he's not just being political for sake of political. I don't think he's just writing these people off. I think there's actually a relatively strong argument to be made that there is a strong influence of the Shabbatian movement, the crypto-Shabbatian movement in Central Europe, especially in the Podolia region, on early Hasidism. But we'll get to Hasidism next. Now, in Podolia, the region I just mentioned in Poland, this movement continues to change and it continues to mutate, and it will mutate into perhaps its most absolutely bizarre form under the leadership of Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was born into a Shabbatian family. He left Podolia to move to the Ottoman Empire. He joined up with the Karkashi sect. In fact, Osman Baba was a witness at his wedding in 1752. 1752, folks. We're in 1752, FYI. Like, this is 25 years or so until, the American Revolution. So he moved back to Podolia, and he begins to practice a kind of pretty serious quasi-transgressive form of Judaism, and we have what is called the Landstrom affair, where it seems like in a synagogue he may have had a naked woman who was called the embodiment of the Torah, and they were doing some kind of sex stuff in the synagogue, dancing around this naked woman who was thought to be the embodiment of the Torah. And in 1751, him and his followers were excommunicated by the local rabbis. Now, there is an idea that gets attached to Frankism and Shabbatianism, which is called mitzvah haba'ah ba'avera. This is sometimes translated as redemption through sin, but this is a complete misreading of what's going on in Shabbatism. In fact, almost everybody who totes this idea, I think, is just misguided. This idea of redemption through sin, that you have to commit sins to become redeemed, this idea of mitzvah haba'ah ba'era, this idea never occurs, and to my knowledge, any Shabbatian writing. It gets hoisted onto the Shabbatians over and over and over again that what they're doing is engaging in antinomian behavior, they're engaging in violations of the Jewish law in order to hasten redemption, in order to plunge themselves into the klipot and redeem the klipot, in order to somehow redeem sin through, or redeem themselves through sin. There's just virtually no evidence that this is what they were practicing. Shabbatai Tzvi never makes that argument, neither does Nathan of Gaza. This term, mitzvah haba'ah ba'era, which is an idea actually found in the Talmud, has to do with can you do mitzvah with a forbidden object? So the classic example is, can you wave a stolen lulav and esrog? And the rabbi said no, right? You can't commit a mitzvah by breaking another mitzvah. And so even the idea of this is just ridiculous, and it's gotten promulgated by a bunch of anti-Semites who have these vast, all modern Jews, or all kinds of people, George Soros or whatever, that these people are somehow part of this Frankist lineage of the Rothschilds and all this stuff, and that they're really secret Frankists and they're engaged in horrifying sins. The more sin they do, they can redeem themselves. So this entire anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is rooted in the idea of the Frankists and the Shabbatians practicing this idea of mitzvah ba'era, but the truth of the matter is they never did this, and that was not what they were up to. And I would say that anyone who wants to believe in this, just show me in the Shabbatian literature where this idea is put forward. I don't know that it ever is. I can't even find a single thing. What Frank does argue is that that what's happening is that he is inaugurating a new Torah. That the new Torah that he is inaugurating is a replacement, right? So you have the Torah Beriah, right? And he's inventing a new Torah. He's conjuring into being a new Torah, the Torah Atzilut, the Torah of this world. And that new Torah is going to inaugurate a new religion that he calls Da'at, wisdom, knowledge. The Das is how you would say it in Ashkenazi Hebrew, but this idea, he's bringing a new form of the Torah into the world, and that new form of the Torah is going to be this thing that he calls a new religion called Da'at, or Das. Now, we'll go through this relatively quickly. What ends up happening is that Frank and his followers are arrested, and they flee to Istanbul. They convert to Islam, like many Frankists or many Shabbatians at the time. And what they end up doing is sort of making a deal with the devil. And by the devil, I mean here Catholic bishops. And what they end up doing is they argue that they represent a camp of Jews who are influenced by the Zohar, who reject the Talmud. And that the other camp, the anti-Shabbatians, the anti-Frankists, accept the Talmud but reject the Zohar. Now, of course, Jews accepted both, and the Shabbatians are trying to parlay with the Catholic Church, basically, so that the local Jewish population can't basically condemn them. The Shabbatians argue with the rabbis. There's a 19 to 40 debate, and the bishop is the person who's going to side with whoever. And the bishop obviously sides with the Shabbatians and against the Talmudists, and the Talmud is condemned, and there are dozens of copies of the Talmud burned in Poland. Now, what ends up happening, again, history is always funny, the bishop decided with the Shabbatians in Poland in 1757, he dies. And a new bishop emerges who is no longer a friend of the Shabbatians. At this point, Frank declares that he's actually the reincarnation of Osman Baba and Shabbatai Tzvi, and he begins to reveal his new religion. And what ends up happening after that is that, this gets so complicated. There's a local bishop who wants to basically prove the blood libel's true, and in order to prove the blood libel, the idea that Jews sacrifice and kill the host, sort of classic anti-Semitic nonsense, he holds another dispute in Lvov in 1759 of the blood libel, but the anti-Talmudists are declared to be not really Jews, and they are to be converted. And Nathan and Frank on September 17th, 1759, basically sides with this bishop, and this bishop stands to gain an enormous amount of land and all kinds of stuff, and also the Jews, including Frank, also stand to gain an enormous amount of privilege by converting to Catholicism. 3,000 Jews were converted to Catholicism on the 17th of September 1759. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. I don't think Frank himself even thought this was going to happen. Now, Frank, being, I think, completely full of himself and just to lose power, holds that this is part of the plan. Just like Shabbatai had to convert to Islam, well, Frank, being the reincarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi and Osman Baba, he's going to plunge himself into the world of Catholicism. And after he converts, he lives a life of a Polish noble. He lives a life of a Polish noble. He's wearing fine clothes, doing all this stuff, but at the same time, he is also engaged in very heterodox behavior, and in a way that the Turkish court would accept Shabbatai engaging in very strange behavior, the local Catholics aren't having it. They are not having it. Eventually, they arrest Frank, and he is basically sent to prison in a monastery for 14 years. So he's arrested and sent to a monastery for 14 years because they do not want to deal with him. The Catholics are not playing around, perhaps in the way that the Turks were. In 1772, Russian forces invade Poland, and they release him. They release him from this monastery where he's being kept. And he kind of cozies up to members of the Holy Roman Empire. He gets comfortable with Joseph II. He meets Paul I, the future Tsar of Russia. And it's in that time period that he writes his principal Frankist Shabbatian work, a text called The Collection of the Words of the Lord, which is published in English now. What ends up happening is that he gets into kerfuffle with Joseph II, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's expelled from the court, and he ends up settling, and eventually he dies of a stroke in 1791. 1791, right? We're like in the middle of the French Revolution at this point, right? 1789, we're just not far out from the terror. At that point, about 1791, his daughter, Ava, takes control of the movement. Again, it's women who rescue this movement. There are about 25,000 Frankists, that is to say, Catholics living as crypto-Jews in Poland in the late 18th century. And what ends up happening is Ava Frank, leads the movement into the future, basically building a giant court around her. She actually claims that she's the daughter of all these Russian royalty or whatever. And there's a huge Shabbatian center at both Warsaw and Prague, both under her control. And she lives like a princess, folks. I mean, people, like, the amount of money that she spent to maintain her lifestyle basically bankrupted the movement. And when she died in September of 1816, the movement was so heavily indebted that it began to collapse under its own weight. I mean, she lived like a monarch in the areas that she lived in. By the 1880s, we know that the movement's sort of limping on, although many people at that point had begun to realize that just being Catholic is a better idea than trying to maintain this bizarre double life. And so many people through the 1860s and 70s began to convert and began just to be Catholic, just continue to be Catholic. And by the 1880s, we have very little evidence that people are practicing crypto-Judaism anymore. They're no longer Shabbatian, but they're still very emotionally connected to Ava Frank. In fact, Ava Frank became sort of a cult of personality all of her own. It became less about Shabbatai Tzvi and less about Nathan, less about Frank and more about her and her cult of personality. And what we end up having is people basically by the 1880s have largely converted to basically just literal Catholicism, although some people deconvert. Some people deconvert and go back to Judaism. So there's a bit of a split there. And the evidence that split, you may know this family. It's a very Catholic family. They become a pretty Catholic, pretty famous Catholic person. I'm pretty sure I'm going to pronounce their name wrong, but you probably recognize the Wojtyla family, right? You probably know who that is. That's the family of John Paul II. That's the family of John Paul II. There is good evidence, good reason to believe that the former Pope, John Paul II, is a descendant of one of the converted Frankish families, right? Now, that's the side that became Catholic. Obviously, John Paul II is pretty Catholic, and he comes probably from one of these Frankish families. On the other side, another group of families that deconvert, that go back to a kind of liberal Judaism, a kind of Turkish-style Judaism, like the Young Turks. A very liberal, progressive form of Judaism is the Brandeis. And of course, the Brandeis, as you may know, Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And when Louis Brandeis died, when they were going through his effects, one of the things they found in his family inheritance was an image, a picture of Eva Frank. He came from a Frankish family, and he kept this heirloom. Now, does that mean that Louis Brandeis was a Frankist and a crypto-Shabbatian, blah, 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 blah? No. He probably was a liberal Jew, just like many liberal Jews that you can recognize from lots of places anywhere in the United States at the time. But he maintained an image, he gave a picture of Eva Frank, and he comes from a Frankist family. Do I think he was a practicing Shabbatian in any form or fashion? Absolutely not. It's ridiculous any more than I think that John Paul II was a practicing Frankist. Although what I want to point out here as I wrap up tonight, Frankism, Shabbatianism had a huge impact on the development of Judaism. Huge impact. The idea that you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40 and married and all that, that's a response to the Frankist, to the Shabbatian movement. The internal reality of Judaism in Central Europe, the rise of Hasidism, is probably at some level a Frankist movement, a part of, or at least a Shabbatian, an expression of a kind of Shabbatian. The intense hatred of the Hasidic movement by the Mizrahi is probably part of their anti-Shabbatian movement. And we have prominent families who emerged in the aftermath of the disaster of Shabbatianism and Frankism, both in the rise of the world of Turkey, the rise of the Young Turks, and the rise of the Turkish national movement. And then we have families who are very prominent Polish families, like the family of John Paul II and the family of Brandeis, who ultimately emerged from the Frankist movement, from the Shabbatian movement, and are part of world history in a big way. There are even neo-Shabbatians. There are neo-Shabbatians. In fact, my channel, the Esoterica channel, I have a couple of folks who are neo-Shabbatians. I expressed the idea that Shabbatianism was a catastrophe for Judaism. I'm not going to apologize for that. I think it was a catastrophe. But I think if someone finds Shabbatites to be an interesting spiritual figure, all the better for them. But what I just want to hammer home tonight, as I wrap up this lecture tonight, is that we cannot imagine Judaism coming into modernity without Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi is the bridge, in many ways, of Judaism from the world of the medieval world, medieval Kabbalah, and he is the bridge to modernity. Hasidism, the Haskalah, Zionism, all of that, at some level, has to be seen as in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi, as in the shadow of the Shabbatian movement. All of the Messianic stuff in the Chabad Lubavitch movement, Reform Judaism, all of it, at some level, it is the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi. And there's that we can deny, I don't think. And so, in many ways, if you want to understand modern Judaism, you have to understand it at some level as a response to the Shabbatian. And in that way, in a big way, Shabbatai Tzvi is still around. Because in many ways, we are living in the shadow cast by this peculiar Messiah who apostatized to Islam and continued to be Jewish or something. So, to drive this point home and to put a fine point on it tonight as we wrap up, modernity, Jewish modernity, is in many ways in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi. And the more we learn about him, the more we understand him, the more we understand his movement, the movement that came after him, whether it is fractures in his death or the Frankist movement, what have you, the better we understand Jewish origins and modernity, whether it be the Haskalah, the Hasidic movement, the Misnagdim, whatever. They're all in the shadow of this guy. And I think it's quintessentially important to understand him, Nathan of Gaza, theology, the Kabbalah really is in many ways downstream of him. And so, Shabbatai Tzvi, a Messiah in many ways, in a lot of ways, I think of Judaism in some ways, of pre-modern Judaism is bookmarked between two messiahs, and that's Jesus. You can bookmark Judaism in some ways, medieval ancient Judaism between those two bookmarks, and that modernity is in the aftermath of the Shabbatai. So, whether you like him or not, whether you're embarrassed of him or not, whether you think he's crazy or not, whatever, you certainly can't deny, I don't think you can deny, that we have not, as a Jewish population, to a real grasp of the impact that he made. And I think that we're worse off for that. I think the better we understand Shabbatai Tzvi and his messianic movement and his vicissitudes, the better we will understand Judaism, and the better we will understand Jewish modernity, and the better we will understand Zionism, and all of that. And if we don't do that, we do that at our peril. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me. I explore the Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work, providing accessible, free, on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and magic, primitive philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next